everybody. This is Rosario, second period honors biology, and this is my building a better sourdough bread experiment. Rise or sour? So the problem I wanted to address in the sourdough bread experiment and what is going to be the independent variable is going to be the sour flavor of the bread. In the last bread that I made a couple weeks ago, there was enough of the rise in the bread, but it didn't have the sour flavor that I had wanted and I had envisioned. In this experiment, my goal was to get that bread to be more sour. How will I get it more sour? There was a plethora of different ways to make the bread more sour I found on the internet, but one really stood out to me. One of the tips that were on this website to get a more flavorful in sourness, you need to alter the routine of feeding the starter. To get a more sour bread, the starter needs to go longer without food. The hungry starter will develop acetic acid, which is specifically responsible for the sour flavor, along with lactic acid. When starter gets constantly fed, the resulting bread results in a more mild flavor. I want to try out this method and see if the bread really does get sour. What are the variables? The independent variable will be the sour flavor, and the dependent variable will be how often the starters are fed. The confounding variables will be all the preparation. These flour and water each starter gets when they are fed in their perspective, and the only thing different is that they will be fed at different times. So my experiment design would be that I would have two bowls with starters, and in one bowl it will follow the regular directions for preparing, feeding, cooking it. This would be my controlled starter, and in the second bowl with starter it would be fed less. But other than that, it would be the same as the control. In a span of 2 weeks, I will be feeding the control bowl every day, while the second bowl will be fed every 2 days. By the end of 2 weeks, I will be baking and testing which of the two starters resulted in a more sour tasting bread. And my hypothesis heading into the experiment was feeding the starter less will result in a bread that has a more sour flavor. Starter, which was being fed less, had only 4 cups of flour and only 2 and 2/3 cup of water. The experiment. So I had gotten done kneading everything after 2 weeks, or feeding both of the starters for 2 weeks, and I started kneading everything and getting it into this dough. And it started off like this with control on the left side and the one that's supposed to be more sour on the right side. And this was it after about like 8 hours, 8 to 12 hours, and they both rose pretty high. And what I saw was that the control actually rose a little bit higher, and why I think that, or one of the reasons why I think that it rose higher is because the yeast was able to eat more of what was in the flour, and so it was able to produce more air and made it rise more than what the other starter had. So then I covered them in a damp towel and put them in my fridge to rise a little bit more. And I did the final preparations of putting them into the shape that they're supposed to be, preheating my oven and getting them onto a baking sheet, and then finally baking them, and they turned out pretty good right here. So my conclusion was that my results actually supported my hypothesis, and my hypothesis was that feeding the starter less will result in a more sour flavor in the bread. The starter that was fed less had a significantly more sour flavor than the starter that was fed every day. I gave my cousins the bread, the both of the breads, and I didn't tell them which one would be the more sour one and which one was just the regular one. And I also had a taste for myself too, and and all of us found that the one that was supposed to be more sour was obviously the more sour one. So there was no chance involved in the final product. And another interesting find that I had was that there was a different shape in the dough and the ending bread with the starter that was supposed to be more sour. It was more square shape and it ended up a little bit more square shape, while the control one was more round and kind of more circular. So a scientific explanation for this is when the starter is not getting fed, the starter develops more acetic acid, which is more of like the vinegar like sour. And a follow-up experiment that I would like to try is how temperature really affects the starter and overall how the bread is. That was another tip that I found online, but it never said anything about colder temperature, so I want to try that. So I was thinking of doing maybe three different starter bowls, with one in room temperature as the control, one in a warmer temperature, and one in a colder temperature. Doing the same procedures and processes for each and just keeping the temperature the same. The end. Thanks for watching.